Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be doing a makeover on my cultured marble bath from Vanity by applying an epoxy finish. The first step of this process will be to remove the faucet and the drain plug. Next, I'm going to scrape away all the old caulk around the side splashes and backsplash since mine is starting to come off. So I will have to replace this with new latex-based water-resistant caulk. Now you can skip this step if the caulk still looks good, but if you have silicone caulk, then you will have to remove it and replace it with latex-based caulk because the silicone will repel the epoxy, which will prevent the epoxy from being able to stick to it and dry on it. For this next step, you will want to wear a mask and you may want to have eye and hearing protection. I'm going to be using a random orbit sander, a corner cat sander, and a sanding block. However, if you don't have those, you can just get by with just using a sanding block. Because the cultured marble has a very smooth surface, we need to roughen it up to be able to provide a better mechanical bond for the priming that's going to come up later on. I would recommend sticking to a sanding grit between 120 and 220. We're not looking to remove any material here, we just want to cause enough scratches on the surface to provide a good bond for that primer. When it comes to sanding the top of the backsplashes, I recommend using an angled sanding block because it'll allow you to get the top without damaging your walls. I also highly recommend the sanding block for when you sand the sink bowl. This is going to be something you have to do by hand. You won't be able to get a corner cat sander in there, at least not all the way in. So highly recommend you use the sanding block for that as well. And again, I'm using a 220 grit for everything for this process so I don't remove too much material and I'm just lightly scratching that surface. I'm also going to lightly sand inside the faucet holes and the drain hole. To do this, I just took a piece of sandpaper and I rolled it up to be able to fit it inside there, and I want to make sure I remove any sort of gunk that might be around those edges. Once you are done sanding, I highly recommend you vacuum the entire bathroom so you can get as much dust out of the bathroom as possible. With the sanding dust removed, we now want to clean the vanity using TSP. If you have never used TSP before, it stands for trisodium phosphate. It is a very strong cleaning chemical that is primarily used in preparation for painting, and you apply it to the walls beforehand to clean any sort of grease or dirt off of your walls, and it will also remove any sort of glossiness that the paint has. So if you are cleaning any surface with this, be careful to avoid any sort of painted surfaces if you don't want to remove that gloss. At this point, I am ready to start painting, so I'm going to go ahead and start taping off all the areas around the vanity. Now, if you are someone who typically paints by using a paint and primer in one, I'm afraid to say that is not going to work for this process. So you're going to have to use a specialty primer called bonding primer. Bonding primer can typically be found in a small section of specialty primers right next to where your normal primers in the store are. I didn't even bother to pour my primer into a tray. I just dipped my roller directly into it, and a little of it is going to go a long ways because this is a pretty thick primer and you're working on a very smooth surface. The hardest parts of this entire project is going to be any time you are dealing with the sink bowl. So in this case, trying to paint the entire sink bowl with the primer will be a little bit difficult, so you might want to use a paintbrush to help you out in this situation. In this process, I'm going to be using Stone Coat Countertops Black Marble Epoxy Kit. This kit includes a black paint to apply over the bonding primer. Ultimately, there really isn't anything special about this paint. It's really just a flat black paint that comes with this kit. So if you want to use a different epoxy brand rather than Stone Coat Countertops kit, and it doesn't come with any sort of paint in their kit, all you need to do is go to your local hardware store and just buy a flat paint of whatever color that you want your countertop to look like. I ended up applying 3 coats of black paint and sanding between each coat to remove any imperfections. After the final coat, I waited a full 24 hours before applying the epoxy. I recommend keeping the area as clean as possible so that while the paint dries, you don't get any dust or hairs into that final coat because that could be reflected in your epoxy process later on. Now that all the prep work is done, I'm ready to start the epoxy process. Now I need to make about 3 ounces of epoxy per square foot, and since I'm working with a 5x2 Vanity, I will need to make about 30 ounces of epoxy overall. Now I'm going to end up making 28 ounces of black epoxy, 2 ounces of white epoxy, and 2 more ounces of gold epoxy. You want to start by pouring part B into your mixing container first and then adding part A, following up by mixing for a minimum of 2 minutes. For small amounts of epoxy, I will use a stir stick, but for larger amounts, I will use a paddle mixer and my drill. Since I want to achieve a black marble finish for this vanity, I'm going to start by pouring my black epoxy onto the surface and spreading it around. You'll notice that I have taped off the holes for the sink faucet and the drain plug, and the reason for this is to keep the epoxy from escaping at this point, because I want to spread that around and not waste it by just having it go down those holes. Typically, I would use a 1/8 inch notch trowel to spread the epoxy around. However, that tool is a little bit big for this surface, so I'm going to use a 3/8 inch putty knife instead. You will want to hold about 2 to 4 ounces of black epoxy in reserve, and this will be used on the back and side splashes as well as the sink bowl. After covering the surface of the vanity, take the remaining epoxy held in reserve and apply it to the backsplash, side splashes, and to the sink bowl using your 2-inch chop brush. For applying epoxy to the backsplashes, I like to paint the epoxy onto the top edge and then allow the excess to run down the sides. After I apply epoxy to the sink bowl and the backsplashes, I'll come back and chop the entire surface of the vanity, and when I do that, I will make sure to chop that excess material that flowed down the sides and put it back onto the backsplash surface to ensure that it is properly covered. Make sure you have something to block the drain hole so that your epoxy cannot escape down there. If you have something down there to block it, it will start to puddle up as it naturally self-levels. Then you will want to take that puddle of epoxy and reapply it to the sides of the sink bowl to ensure you have the proper thickness of epoxy for when it dries and settles. If you feel that you have an excess amount of epoxy gathering at the bottom of the sink bowl, then you can simply remove it using the chop brush to add it back to one of your mixing containers. I also highly recommend having something underneath the drain hole and the faucet holes to collect any epoxy that might get out so that you don't make a mess in your vanity cabinet. Next, you want to make sure to chop the entire surface of the vanity. This will remove any lines that were created in the epoxy as you spread it around, and you want to pay special attention to the backsplashes to make sure that they have full coverage and you don't have any areas where the epoxy is too thin. After chopping the entire vanity, you want to use a torch or a heat gun to remove any air bubbles that are in the epoxy. At this point, I'm now ready to add my white and my gold epoxies. So I'm going to start with my white epoxy first, and I'm just going to let it drizzle off of the chop brush and onto the surface, and then I'm going to chop those lines and spread it around, and then repeat the same process with the gold epoxy. When adding additional colors to your base color, feel free to experiment and do whatever you like to be able to create the visual effect that you want to have your surface look like in the end. After I finish adding my colors, I'm going to hit the surface with my heat gun. The benefit of using a heat gun instead of a torch is that the extra airflow coming out of the heat gun will move that material around so you can kind of swirl and blend your colors a bit more. As I clean up my tools here at the end, I'm going to torch the surface of the epoxy about 2 to 3 more times over the next 10 to 15 minutes to remove any additional air bubbles that might appear. Around 90 minutes after finishing the epoxy process, you want to come back and remove any paper and tape, and you want to do it very carefully to ensure that you don't disturb and damage the settling epoxy. Alright guys, the bathroom vanity is now complete. Now if you notice in the final shots that it might have looked a little bit different, and that's because after the epoxy dried, I went and applied what's called the ultimate top coat, which provides a kind of scratch resistant surface so that the epoxy won't get damaged. Now I did film that, however, I made some mistakes because it was my first time using the product. So I decided not to include in this footage so that I won't be teaching you guys the wrong way to go about it. So when I get that process down, I will show how to do that. However, even with the few little mistakes I made during the application process, I still really like how Vanity turned out. So if you're looking at doing something to make over your cultured marble countertops, I do highly recommend stone coat countertops, epoxy, and apply that process correctly, and you should love the results as well. So if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, click that subscribe button and the bell, and I'll see you next time on the DIY Grind.